So when I was a kid, they showed me the pyramid of what you're supposed to eat, grains and meats and vegetables, with sugar on top and wheat down below. Of course, as an Italian, you had to flip that around. I just had more sugar. But where did this come from? Why do we even have it? Josh Sauter wrote an interesting paper for the Foundation for Economic Education, great organization. Why were you curious in the history of the food pyramid?
So I feel like this is very misrepresented by most people. Most people don't really understand what has gone into this, and they like to blame corporations, which certainly aren't innocent, but the government plays a very large role in this.
You mean that the government was a tool of big corporations to get you to eat the products that big corporations want you to eat?
That's part of it, yeah. I mean, lobbyists essentially...
Any truth to that?
Say again?
Any truth to that?
Yeah, there's some truth to that. I mean, lobbyists play a large role in government in general, but especially in the food industry. You could go back to companies like Archer Daniels Midland. Dwayne Andreas was one of the most well-connected lobbyists in probably the history of America. He funded both sides of the aisle for years and years. He was involved in a large price-fixing scheme with his company. His son actually went to jail. The movie The Informant, starring Matt Damon, is actually about his company and the massive amount of corruption that they went through. But
so when did the pyramid start? I remember it as a kid. When was it created?
So there's a lot going on there. So basically, the McGovern Commission was sort of the predecessor to the food pyramid. So that was Senator George McGovern. He got involved in that in the early 70s, and then they released their findings in 79. So sometime around that, they started with the creation of the pyramid.
They being the FDA?
FDA was not so much involved. This was more USDA and the Department of Health, and eventually it became just the USDA.
Okay.
So a lot of it was based off McGovern's work, which was based off a scientist named Ansel Keys, who did a whole bunch of studies. He did his famous 7-country study and the 6-country analysis. So he did those, which led to McGovern. McGovern did all of his research, and then the USDA started creating the food pyramid. They wanted something fun and simple that they could sell. I don't know if they were aiming at children, but that's certainly what ended up happening. So the actual pyramid came out in 91.
91?
Yeah, it took them a long time to actually finish it.
Then what did I see when I was a kid? I could have sworn I saw the food pyramid as a grade school kid.
You're probably,
in the 70s.
My guess would be looking at I believe it was the famous 4 or the 4 or the 7. I forget the term, but they had the 4 food groups. That's what it was.
Yes.
In the 1950s, yes. And then that was later changed to 7, or actually reverse that, 7 then 4.
Right, so let me ask you, when they made this pyramid, did they get it right? And isn't that a completely subjective thing? I mean, the idea that the government will know what the right diet is when everybody has different opinions on it, how do you even judge if they got it right?
So that's kind of the time-old question. Nutrition is one of the most subjective in the sense that everyone is looking at different research. You got your vegans, you got your paleo, keto. They all have dramatically different views on it. And a lot of them are looking at the same science that has been interpreted differently. So overall, I would say no, the government did not get it right. They got it probably about as wrong as they could have. But there still are a lot of things that are still being debated even now. So
let's take eggs or dark chocolate or something like that. It's good for you, and then the next year it's bad for you, and then they push fake eggs or just egg whites, and then they say, no, that's bad for you, and then they switch it around. Butter is bad for you, and then we move over to trans fats. And they say, no, trans fats are bad for you. You need the saturated fats that, and it's frustrating. I don't mind that happening in the world of public opinion. I find it insulting when it has the seal of government approval, that this is on high, we have declared something. Talk to me about like trans fat. Wasn't trans fat supposed to be good for you by comparison?
So originally, yes, they believed that trans fats were not as healthy as saturated fats. So trans fats
not as healthy or more healthy?
Sorry. They believed that trans fats were a better source than saturated fat. So they push people towards things like vegetable oil, which is
margarine.
Yes, margarine would be another one. Margarine, vegetable oil, shortening, Crisco, all these things which are misleading in basically their health stats. And those were, for the most part, are created in a lab. So Crisco was invented in about 1910 by a company called Procter & Gamble, and government studies eventually pushed people towards those things and away from animal products and saturated fat. based off the work
So
of
what is
scientists.
Crisco? Mostly just motor oil? And,
Hydrogenated oil, for the most part.
really? So just get some good 1040 and you'll be fine?
Not the same thing, but something like that.
Something like that. And then we found out later the argument is, no, get rid of trans fats.
Yes. So there's actually a scientist, his name is Fred Kummerow, and he's been working on this for about 60 years. He just died a couple of years ago, I believe. He sued the FDA in 2013 to try and get them to change the FDA labeling requirements for trans fat, because the labeling requirements are very confusing. So prior to 2006, you didn't have to put it on the label at all, so it wasn't on there. So maybe, I don't know if you remember this, I graduated high school that year, so I remember every product
I do not remember
I
you
saw,
graduating high school, no.
Every product I saw in 2006 said no trans fat on the label.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
And that's actually confusing, because they can legally claim no or 0 grams trans fat if it's 0.4 or less per serving. They can round down to 0. That's essentially how it works. And since serving sizes are largely arbitrary, they can round down they choose the serving size and then round down for everyone. So you can have a bag of chips that's 100 serving sizes if they want to. And then you could have 0.4 grams of trans fat per serving. So you're looking at 0.4
For a while,
times
it was
100.
all about low fat. You know, this is what we need. You need low fat this, low fat that. And now we're finding out, no, you need your fat, which makes me the healthiest man in Colorado. So where are we now?
Still in debate. If you look at government policy, they're generally going to push you away from away from high fat products, particularly saturated fat. They tend to push you towards what they refer to as healthy fats, monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. There's some debate even among most dietitians in that
Doesn't this
community.
just boil down to simple common sense, which is eat a varied diet, heavy in vegetables, and stay away from carbs and sugars especially, and you'll be okay. Isn't that boil it down to that?
For the most part, yes. If you look at sort of a paleo approach, I think that's the best way. Natural foods, if it had a face, you're probably pretty safe. Vegetables are generally good, but then you get misnomers like vegetable oil, which come from things like soybean or corn or canola, and that's what the government was pushing for a long time. And it's very difficult when you go to fast food places because they cook everything in either trans fat or canola oil, and you get too much of one thing.
All right, bring it back to the large picture, though. I don't believe the government has a role doing this. I mean, I think it's great to have guidelines. I think it's great to have scientists come together and nutritionists. But when the government says this is what it's supposed to be, it then leads to things like Michelle Obama dictating what should be in schools.
Right.
And it takes it away from individuals, and it has this feeling of this is correct. My favorite photograph ever is of the 1917 Tour de France. And all the guys are about ready to pedal up a big hill, and they all have cigarettes in their mouth. Why? Because the science said, well, if you smoke a cigarette before you take the big hill, it's going to open up your lungs and get you more oxygen going up there. And we look at this now and laugh, but who's to say whatever they're telling us now is not just as laughable? Shouldn't the government just step the hell out of this?
Yes.
How would that happen?
That is a difficult question. I don't know if I can answer that. I mean, we can keep pushing for sustainable policies and real science that is not heavily steeped in the propaganda of the last 100 years. The government has, for the most part, not changed its stance on almost anything for the last 50, 70 years even.
As far as nutrition?
For the most part. Trans fat is actually going to be banned starting next year. So that is one thing that they have finally stepped in to do.
Is that a good thing?
Mostly, I think it is, but there's some debate about that as well.
Why do we want them to ban anything?
If it was up to me, I would say ban nothing. But if they're going to ban something, that is probably the best thing for them to ban. But I'm with you. I don't think we should be in the business of banning anything.
So, when your kid comes home with the pyramid, can you tell him to toss it?
My kid won't be going to public school, so I think he'll be okay.
All right, so what's your diet, by the way?
Mostly paleo. I occasionally do a ketogenic diet, which is a high-fat diet, which there's a lot of science to show that it can have cancer-fighting benefits.
You might want to try the
things.
pasta and Oreo diet. It's worked well for me.
I was on that for about 14 years as a chubby kid.
You could be that. Listen for me on K-How Radio. Read me in the Denver Post. Tell a friend about the Independence Institute. We'll see you next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.